If there's one man who can help, if there's one man who can help, it's the man coming in here right now.
Hello everyone and welcome to a podcast made Full Metal, which is the Full Metal Alchemist 2003 fan guide, which is done typically on Full Metal Fridays. That's usually Fridays around 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Sometimes might miss a week or two there. And that's going to be roughly an episode for each week of the year, if we include the movie. So I'm going to be playing catch up a little bit this episode because the last couple weeks I was a bit busy, got behind. And so we're going to be doing kind of a cluster of episodes combined into what I'm calling the Lab 5 arc. That's going to be episodes 19 through 22, The Truth Behind Truths, Soul of the Guardian, The Red Glow, and Created Human. Now, a lot of meaty stuff really happens in these episodes. Basically, the Elrics get eventually into Lab 5. Even though Ross is kind of the person that inspires them again, it's interesting that she says, okay, you should hold back and not go there. But then, of course, the boys do go in there. And as they're entering, I never realized that with the traps in there, there's a lot of Indiana Jones references, like the giant stone ball. Never really thought about that before. Ed and Al end up encountering number 48 and number 66, who are guarding Laboratory 5, and have a battle with them. And in their battles with these two, they learn that they are in fact like Al. They are beings who had their souls transmuted into suits of armor. And they were former criminals that we'll find is kind of a recurring theme at Lab 5, were used for various alchemical experiments. Number 48 was a killer known as the Slicer, who in his battle with Ed we find out is actually two brothers in one suit of armor because his head's cut off and the body can still fight. And Al fights Barry the Chopper outside, who pretty much quickly reveals his identity, in that he and the Elric brothers did encounter each other before. Gets even more intense when Scar, who's been on their tail, ends up joining the fray and kind of saving Al from Barry, because even though he's basically on his quest to kill Ed, he doesn't feel anything necessarily for Al, even though technically he might be an abomination in his eyes. There's kind of a little bit of development that starts there with Scar and Al because he sees that sort of familiar brotherly relationship that he and Ed share. So that might start to turn a little bit in Scar's favor. However, Barry gets away, causing an explosion, which in fact lets Greedfree, who's been imprisoned under some sort of alchemical spell in some sort of transmutation circle prison. Slicer leads Ed down further into the lab, where we learn that there are in fact more experiments going on down there, and somebody has been creating some form of unstable red stone, basically an imperfect philosopher's stone, and is working on some experiments. There's some chimeras down there, and it turns out that Tucker is alive and still doing his experiments and is using these near-perfect stones to try and create homunculi like Nina. Because at this time, of course, the homunculi reveal themselves and attack Ed and Al, explaining a little bit about who they are, and that they have been in fact pulling the strings of the brothers up to this point. They initially try to trick Ed into using this red matter that was originally converted from humans, which they know, to create a philosopher's stone because Ed is so talented and the homunculi can't do it themselves. Although it is revealed that in fact behind these walls that basically have the liquid within them, there is in fact an area which is holding actual live human beings there. So Ed would in fact be killing people and transmuting actual living humans, one of whom is Sulph J. Kimbley, the Crimson Alchemist, who was a prisoner who was known for causing people to explode. That was kind of his thing. We saw him briefly in a flashback in an earlier episode, demonstrating the power of the red stones. Now, it seems like Ed is actually about to go through with doing this massive transmutation, although he does pull out at the last second. Scar actually does intervene to help, and then right after that, Fuhrer King Bradley has actually taken on a rescue mission with Hughes and Armstrong to look into what's going on in Lab 5, because apparently it's been going on underneath his authority. He is saying he didn't exactly know everything that was going on. So the Elric brothers are in fact saved, although there might be a rift forming because of some of the things that Barry and Tucker had said, which have caused Al to maybe question certain things about himself. And the homunculi do manage to get away, which I find kind of silly considering nobody questions gluttony, because he looks a bit strange. I know that envy can transform and lust looks fairly human, but I mean, Gluttony didn't even have a full uniform, so I don't know. It's some of the light comedy, I suppose. Well, that was kind of roughly going through all the episodes. I didn't go as much into specific plots for each one because they are kind of directly connected, and I felt like I'd probably spend a decent amount of time actually diving a little more into the content of these episodes because as I was watching and I realized, wow, once again, this is Fullmetal Alchemist, and all these different ideas kept coming up. There are a lot of little conversations here that the series overall does get into, but they really touch upon a lot, and there's like a lot of little conversations about major themes that pop up in these episodes. But as far as my overall feelings, really, I think these episodes are all very good. I mean, this is kind of getting to the real meat of the story. It's really getting into what I would consider to be the main plot of the story in this version. It's also where it starts to kind of deviate more from the manga. There's some decent fights here with some good strategy between Ed and the Slicer. I think there's some pretty good fights. Probably a little bit of strategy and some tension. We really kind of feel like Ed's in some mortal peril there. On the side with Al, it's a little more psychological, which we'll get into. Really, though, I would say that these episodes kind of focus a lot more on some really heavy themes, particularly on the idea of humanity, specifically what it means to be human in regards to identity and memory. And if we really can kind of say that our identity is really tied with our memories, if that's all we have to go on, is that really enough? Because there's also been the question that's kind of been touched upon in earlier episodes and throughout the series, is at what line we consider human life to be valuable, or, what makes a human life valuable at all? Because we've got Barry the Chopper and the Slicer who, in addition to being criminals who were considered, I guess, legally were kind of given up their rights because of what they did, that then were used kind of questionably by the state for these experiments, were considered less than human. They don't even consider themselves human. And I think it's actually one of those interesting elements where the show manages to make you actually feel sympathy for these killers because they're actually kind of saddened by their state, saying, they feel taunted by Ed because they feel like, okay, we're not actually human, and if we did become human with this Philosopher's Stone, we would just be executed because we were so evil. But in a weird way, it kind of shows to, maybe it's that little bit of that strong protagonist element of the shonen uplifting spirit, which isn't as obviously as magnified in a show like Fullmetal Alchemist, but it's still there where Ed and Al have this positive effect on people. Like they really are kids and they're good-hearted people, so they actually do care. Like they don't want these people to die, and they do want to find a way to kind of make it right. Even Ed's even like, no, there has to be a way. If we bring you back, maybe you can live. He's not really thinking about how bad these people really were. There's that element of the physicality and the body horror of that. There really is a lot of body horror in FMA, which I've touched on before, because there's the transmutation. There's, of course, the chimera stuff again, where that we're going to get into more of these people who are no longer entirely humans, or they considered monsters by people. And we've got the whole psychological, philosophical, existential question that Al's going to go through, because Barry really plants that seed of doubt in his head, like, okay, well, if all you have are your memories, can you really trust them? I mean, all you have to go off of by apparently what happened is what Ed said, and maybe if his brother died, maybe you are just sort of fake imitation. And we get that idea of the fake imitation through the homunculi, which are probably the best example of that, because they are essentially artificial humans. They are very much like humans, but apparently there's something missing, the soul. Actually, Envy has an interesting line that I picked up on when Ed kind of mentions, okay, well, there must be a creator for you all that you could probably ask to make you human, because he probably used the stone, or he had at least some great skill to perform creating homunculus. And Envy has that line, we weren't created, we were born. And as we would kind of learn later, it's that sort of like, there's that power, that ether, that elemental spiritual core that lies beyond the gate and the truth, which is sort of like the source of life, which is kind of intricately related with the alchemical powers, as we'll learn more about. But it's interesting this kind of ties into that, because I'll be honest, I always did kind of think in more simplistic terms that the homunculi were created, and they are kind of like shadows and imperfect clones, echoes of these other people, and that in exchange for the fact that they don't have souls, they have these weird powers and they're essentially immortal. But in a way, they weren't created from nothing, much like with the whole idea of equivalent exchange. There was like a life essence that was created. So maybe it is elements of the person that we find in an imperfect transmutation, which we'll learn about later, but also elements of what's beyond the gate. And of course, in this show, there is the element of the other side and other dimensions and things like that. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. I always kind of liked it when it was a little more vague, which I think Brotherhood actually, I kind of like the fact that it sort of keeps it a little more ambiguous. But we still kind of get that sense here, which I like, that the homunculi are sort of their own weird things. Of course, we've got Barry the Chopper, who I think is a fun villain. He's got some good comedy. I actually really like the Slicer. I think those brothers are really good villains as well. I really like their conversation with Ed. They almost have this weird honorable sense to them, which I didn't think in the dub really necessarily fit with the serial killer. But I don't know, maybe that's just kind of going against expectations and assumptions and stereotypes. Introduction to Kimblee, I think he's a good villain too. I know he's like a fan favorite, and maybe I should do a video on Kimblee at some point, because I feel like a lot of the Fullmetal Alchemist villain videos seem to be the most popular of the analysis and discussion video essay things that I've done in the past. So it's interesting. Kimblee has never really been my favorite, although I think that he might be one of the aspects in Brotherhood I enjoy more, but who knows, we may get to that at some point. His introduction here is really good, though, where he just kind of murders that one of the prisoners just very casually. And we see Greed briefly. Greed's great in this series. And of course, I love the Tucker reveal. I think this is one part of the series that I watched a lot, so, to me it was obviously expected, but I know this was a great twist. It's just kind of glad that this version kept Tucker in as such an integral part of the show, and that he's working with the homunculi. It's pretty great. My favorite Fullmetal moments, there are a couple. One's the Tucker reveal. I just love his whispering that he does. That's just really creepy how he's bent backwards like that. And I love at the end of the one episode with transitions, I believe it was probably the end of the Red Glow, when he's saying, okay, well, it would take a really skilled alchemist to complete this. And Ed's basically like, yeah, well, I'm not an ordinary alchemist. And I always loved how there's that frame of Tucker just smirking slightly. And it's kind of, I realized there could be a lot of combinations of emotions there, because I always saw that as it's interesting that Tucker is still trying to be this great scientist and achieve greatness, and he's willing to still commit these horrible acts to achieve this greatness. And this time it is still trying to kind of at least make up for something. Like, he's at least trying to make up for what he did to his daughter, but he hasn't really learned that much, because he's still willing to murder all these people. He's saying, hey, if these people are already in this state, then okay, we can do this. What's this point? They're not really human anymore. But he's still, the fact that he's willing to trick Ed into almost killing these people and then just kind of convince him to. It's almost like it's evil in a way, but it's also like he's kind of bringing Ed to his way of thinking, to the dark side, if you wish. And because Tucker was one of those kind of ancillary substitute father figures in the series, and of course he's a kind of a corrupt one that was a mentor that Ed really looked up to as the pinnacle of what science can do and what alchemy can do, and that's really interesting. And of course there's let's see, a couple other things I really liked. I'm just going to mention a bunch here. I like when Ed's about to actually perform the transmutation to kill the prisoners to save Al, because the homunculi are threatening to kill him, and Scar doesn't intervene right away because he wants to see what Ed's going to do. And it's that subtle thing where his conversation with Al, at first I thought maybe that was pushing it and it wasn't really believable, but that's just how great the characters are and how much they connect. And you're so scared of Scar initially, but he is a human in person with flaws, and we see what motivates him in his backstory with his brother, who clearly dabbled in alchemy as well. And he's just trying to make up for things that his brother did, and he's taking revenge out on anybody that he can, because he's kind of lost himself and so frustrated. And I just love that, he looks at Ed and he just waits for him, and then when Ed doesn't do it, he actually kind of intervenes and is like, you know what, no, your brother needs you. And that's, I love that moment. I love that little shift in Scar's character. That I also think, I didn't think about this years ago, but I think one reason too why Scar might have hesitated is maybe because Ed is so young and he kind of realized that, because there's that flashback to him when he was young. Or maybe it's more that he relates to Al and he doesn't want to leave a brother with, without another member of his family. I mean, he did kill Nina, but he thought that she wasn't really human and was kind of putting her out of her misery. So I guess there was that. I love once again the element of body horror and just the fact that we kind of see, the subtleness of the fact that, we know that Ed, because of his arm, he has that aura of alchemical, basically sort of a loophole where he can do the alchemy without the transmutation circle. He just do the clap and he can basically do whatever is within his means that he can think of. But that's because of the transmutation that didn't go well and the after effects of going to the gate. He has some of that power left over, and that's kind of the exchange for not having his limbs. But that he's so sensitive with that alchemical power, kind of like with Scar's alchemical markings on his arm. When Ed touches the red water, or the red stones, he just like starts to exponentially have his alchemical power grow, but almost beyond his control. He's about to go Super Saiyan almost, or like have a Tetsuo moment. And I love, though, that Ross goes in again as kind of that motherly figure, goes in, calms him down, gives him that embrace. And, it's that strong moment that makes us realize these really are kids. And I also really just liked the assumption Ed made, what are you doing this for to the homunculi, for world domination? And Lust just kind of says, we want to just be human. And I love how that undercuts it, and then undercuts his motivation and his idea of their motivation, because he's thinking like everybody else he's encountered, they're greedy, they're selfish, egotistical, evil humans. These people, these homunculi, these creatures are doing all this, and even though they seem like they say they hate humanity so much, ironically they want to be more human because of what they lack. And it's like the inability to fit in, to be considered human, mortality. It's that classic idea of they're coveting things that a lot of people on the scientific alchemical side are trying to strive against, what they're trying to conquer. Conquering death and gaining great power and achieving great wealth and things like that beyond the scope of maybe what they can typically do. And these homunculi are just trying to get back to that sense of normality, so to speak. So that really vulnerable moment with Lust was just something that I love, that caught Ed off guard, and probably the audience too. It just really showcases what great villains these are, nuanced. And I'm really happy to say that, like, we're starting to see the real layers here. We're going to get into more of what makes this show so good and what makes Fullmetal Alchemist so good. I also want to touch upon another theme I was thinking about when the homunculi say that, okay, nothing can be gained in life without being taken away from somebody else, which is also kind of building on the theme we've seen of just people kind of hurting each other and taking from each other, murdering each other, whether it's the authorities, whether it's these corrupt businessmen, or whether it's somebody like Barry the Chopper who's just murdering people. Like some people who are just literally taking life and causing destruction against something. And Lust is, the homunculi basically say, that this is the only way things really are. This is the only way to really get things done. And, that's just something you'd understand if you weren't, actually a child, if you were an adult. So it's kind of hinting at the sort of coming of age element, which we're going to see more, that, maybe equivalent exchange is not all it's cracked up to be, this rigid philosophy Ed has clung to. But at the same time, it's kind of perverting it just in a dark way. So it's interesting. Like I said, there's a lot of, in these couple episodes, it really has just sort of enhanced stuff we touched upon in the series, but we're going to get into more. Just touched upon a little, but really created a lot of big discussions. So there's a lot to unpack in these episodes. Overall, I would say each of these episodes I'd probably give like an 8. These are some of the best ones I've seen. I don't think they're the best. I want to say there are some they're probably better than this, but these are really good. These are some classic FMA 2003 episodes. Really good stuff here, and I'm excited to talk about more of it. So, yes, if I missed anything, or if I made a mistake or something, please let me know in the comments. I really appreciate people listening, watching, making comments, and sticking with me. I know that my summer's been pretty busy, and my schedule hasn't been quite as consistent with every week as I like, but I have been trying to get these out on Fridays, and if I miss a few weeks, I'll try to bunch them up like this again. But I'm keeping mostly on schedule, which is good. My goal is to at least finish by the end of the year, so we'll see. But yes, thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate it. And in the meantime, everybody, just take care and stay magical.